So it's starting now.
But now it wants, that's fine.
Welcome all to morning, afternoon, evening, wherever you're dialing in from. Today we've got quite a demo-heavy, awesome session with Peter Detender, Microsoft certified trainer from Microsoft. So this session is delivered on behalf of the Microsoft Learning Rooms, in particular the Azure Cloud Commanders Learning Room. So this is just a community using Microsoft Teams where you can come and ask questions. We run these kind of sessions, share knowledge, and help people get certified and up to date with everything that's going on in the cloud. So if you're not a member of my learning room or other learning rooms, please join. We've got different categories, like there's an Azure Fabric one, we've got AI, just about every type of technology product category in the Microsoft ecosystem has a learning room associated to it. So make sure you take a look, join, and be a part of the community. So this call will be recorded for those who cannot make it this morning. So if you don't consent to being recorded, please disconnect your line and you can watch the recording after it's been put up. This session is it's an inclusive session. Everyone's coming from diverse backgrounds, different technical capability. So just be welcoming, respectful, be empathetic, open, understanding. The technology that you might hear about today you may have already been working on it for a couple of years, but there may be people that are only hearing some of these acronyms today. So yeah, use the chat. Feel free to raise your hand if you have any questions, which we encourage you to do, and we'll get to you. So yeah, this is sort of a session on Azure DevOps. So ask me anything with Peter. Peter, do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. Hey everyone, good morning, depending where you're connecting from, right? So yeah, I'm Peter, working for Microsoft Redmond as a technical trainer, which means I provide training to our top customers and partners almost every week, where my core technology domain used to be infrastructure. Actually got a physical data center background a long time ago. Not even going to talk about it anymore. Way too long ago. And then moved into cloud Azure around 2012. 2012. And then from there, did quite a lot of cloud architecting, obviously DevOps. And then about 3 years ago, shifted to the Azure developing side out of delivering AZ 204, our developing classes. And then surprise, surprise, we need to talk about AI every now and then, right? Actually shifting more to AI, which means that maybe at some point in time, it's going to be about using Azure DevOps to automate your, deployments, and maybe not even using a lot of like your own DevOps skills, but actually relying on AI. So that's, I would say, a little bit about me, but it's not about me. So the plan I have, if you know a little bit about me, and Luke knows in the meantime, I hate PowerPoint. Oh, it's getting recorded. I should not say that. I love PowerPoint, but I don't love talking through slides. So the idea we had for this session is actually making it a bit more like open styled, where I didn't prepare anything. Some would call that Peter's being lazy, but that's not the idea. It's about you learning something new. So me and Luke, we talked about this a little bit. Like, what if we, instead of going through a set of slides, going through something that I think is relevant to share with you, why not flipping it around and actually waiting for questions and then using those questions to fill up the 50 minutes we have together. So you're a little bit more in control of the flow of the session. And obviously we do have a backup plan. If there's no questions coming up, then it might be a little bit tricky, but we're not going to finish like, oh, no questions. Thank you. See you next time. We're not going to do that. But then we could still go through some of the ideas that I think topics in Azure DevOps that are or a little bit unknown or maybe a bit more confusing, which means I can share a bit more about that. But if you like that approach where it's you asking questions, I would say go ahead. We could spend like maybe a few minutes, like 5 minutes or so, where you can think about the questions. You can post them in the chat window, and then maybe based on that, I could try and turn them in some sort of a DevOps logic flow to keep it a bit organized. So fire away, I would say.
Yeah. Feel free to raise your hand, put it in the chat. In the meantime, I can start with a question just to get us going. So why Azure DevOps? Why do we need it?
Why Azure DevOps? So, I mean, I'll share my own experience, like what got me into, I would say DevOps, because I started using it a little bit before the product was called Azure DevOps. So it was a team foundation server. And before I moved into the Microsoft trainer role about 5 years ago, I was running my own consulting / architecting / training company and helping customers all over the globe. A lot of it was in person, which means I was traveling, luckily enough, almost every week to some place in the world and providing workshops, where part of the workshops was giving my customers hands-on experience, which means I needed to give them an Azure-based lab environment. And in the early months or 2-3 years, I would say, I was like flying to someplace in the world, arriving typically Saturday or Sunday, and then spending the whole evening, night, or early mornings building my lab environments. 4 or 5 students, 20 students, sometimes even more. Where at some point in time, I was like, well, this is no longer working. Partly because not all deployments were always successful, which means there's no labs on Monday morning, and it's bad for business. So that was
extra stress, right? Extra stress trying to get that deployment out, and it would have been inconsistent as well because.
Yeah. And then the other thing was, and that's the positive side, like the business was growing, which means it was not just me anymore delivering those classes, but actually relying on other trainers to help me, where I needed to build even more lab environments for them because they show up for the training. They don't show up for, oh, we need to manage Peter's backend, right? And that eventually moved me into automation, where I had a collection of PowerShell scripts. I had some sample applications, and I was just gluing everything together. And that eventually talking to some of my friends, like, how can I do this? Because I'm not a developer, so DevOps is probably not the tool that I need. And then eventually somebody told me, like, well, based on what you're doing and the snippets of code you already have, it's going to be so easy for you to bring all that together and creating pipelines. And that's how I started. So that was around 2015. And eventually automated the whole scenario where I could schedule my pipelines. I could inject PowerShell scripts. I could do Azure command line. I could use ARM templates, like all the stuff that we already have and using it in some sort of a manual way. And then the other thing is that because it's based on source control, I also had a backup plan because I had all my scripts, my templates on my local machine. But as you know, traveling with a laptop is sometimes tricky where you try to start it up and all of a sudden it doesn't work anymore. The disk got broken or the screen got broken or anything like, oops, I don't have my machine anymore. And then it's becoming even more challenging. Or making changes in templates, because out of my experience, a template is never successful from the first run, or even a DevOps pipeline. I mean, we all need like 20, 35 takes before it's like 100% successful, right? And that's where you also have those versioning in the source control. So that's what got me into Azure DevOps, where obviously I guess your other question is going to be Azure DevOps or GitHub Actions, right? Where to me, I would say it's not always that important. And the reason why, I mean, out of like even wearing my Microsoft hat, I could say we talk about Microsoft DevOps solutions. we still have Azure DevOps. It's still there. It's still getting improved every month. There's a roadmap publicly available, like what are all the features the product team is working on. And then, yes, some time ago, a couple of years back, we acquired GitHub as an interesting DevOps platform as well. And if you follow a little bit like what Microsoft DevOps Solution stands for, it's literally bringing the best of both worlds together. It's still two environments, but you could run Azure DevOps pipelines because maybe that's what you've been using for so long, where now you go like, well, maybe I should look into GitHub Actions. And that's totally fine. You could migrate a lot of the pipelines. Yes, it's not just migrate a pipeline and translating it, but then maybe why not going back to the AI? You got our Copilot to help you with that, where you could provide a snippet of an Azure DevOps pipeline, like YAML syntax, and it would give you the GitHub Actions alternative language. It's still YAML-based, but obviously it's not the same YAML. Or another scenario that I have, and I could actually do some demos here, is maybe in the initial phase, like why not running Azure DevOps pipeline, the one that you've been using for so long, but triggering it from GitHub Actions to give you that experience where you could move from one environment to another, or using project management, which I think is still one of the coolest things in Azure DevOps, like the whole work items, the Azure boards, and integrating with your GitHub source control or integrating with GitHub pipelines. And really, again, using like the best of each platform without breaking down all the other features in every environment.
It's the whole horses for courses, right? I think I'm in a complete agreement, and I think it really depends on the organization maturity. Like each GitHub and Azure DevOps can achieve what you're after, but you know, GitHub's a lot more native, a lot more code friendly in some areas, but then if you're wanting to do project and work management, but also be easily tie into Enter ID, which a lot of enterprises still, like from my perspective, still do, then Azure DevOps is really where you'd put your code or put your work items. But yeah, it doesn't mean you can't use both, especially with things like GitHub Copilot as well that can run in VS Code. So you can use the capabilities offered by the GitHub platform, but you can still use Azure DevOps to deliver that. So we do have a question in the chat, and it is around, and I think this could be potentially a good demo target as well. Like I'm just putting words in your mouth, but it's really around coding practices, how to ensure secure coding practices with Azure DevOps to make sure that the life cycle, the software development life cycle is secure. So what I'm thinking potentially here is difference between environments. How do you enable branch policies? Things like that. So do you have any thought about the software development life cycles, secure pipelines with Azure DevOps?
Yes, I was just going through the session, and I'll share that link maybe at the end, or you could share it afterwards. Where I got one slide that maybe could help a little bit, and setting the scene on like what does it mean to do like what we would call DevSecOps now, right? So I'm just gonna grab this little piece.
This is the danger with the Unplugged session, right? You can go in all sorts of different directions. I think it's a really good question.
I love that question because it's really, I would say what DevOps is about, and if you think about like overall DevOps, and I'm first going to share this little image here. It's from a more specific session I delivered multiple times. I even think I got a few YouTube recordings from those sessions where it's about like, what does it take to do secure DevOps? Because if you think about DevOps, it's like all those different cycles, it's all those different teams. The easy way, it's like you got developers, you got operations. But if you think about it in not even a larger environment, but you got the business. If they are not asking you to do something, why would you build it, right? But then you got the security teams. They want to know how you handle code. They want to know um, what application you're building, what kind of framework. Is it secure? What kind of packages are you integrating? Can we use them? What are you doing with, I don't know, credentials, connection strings, all that magic, right? And then ultimately, you need to bring all that together in some pipeline motion where you're going to build it, you're going to automate it, and you want to make it as repeatable as possible. So in short, what this slide is talking about is just like in the 5 DevOps process cycles. So you got the developing piece, writing code, or even before that would be the planning phase, where you think about what am I doing? Why are we doing DevOps? A little bit going back to your initial question, right? So before I would say you would even start writing code, which means developers creating applications, maybe infrastructure teams creating PowerShell scripts, Azure CLI, Bicep, Terraform, ARM templates. I would say before you do anything real technical hands-on, you would look into like the threat modeling, which means that you're going to think about what kind of application, where are we going to run it, and what are the potential security risks. If you run something on-prem, it's probably requiring different security management than if you're moving it into cloud. I'm not saying that one is better than the other. It all depends how you configure it, right? But then you also need to know, like, are we running a legacy application? You could maybe, depending obviously on a lot of details, but what if you have a legacy app that's been running on a Windows server for a couple of years, and luckily it's not legacy enough yet, and it can still run on server 60. You're going to deploy that into Azure, but it's an old framework. You got like a Swiss cheese, you could say, with so many security pitfalls. So that's where you're going to run that threat modeling. If it's an application web frontend connecting to some data backend, how do we protect the communication between those two? And again, where do we store credentials and all the other things? We're then in the second pillar here. You're going to move to what I would describe as the code writing. And again, it could be application code, could be ARM templates, Bicep, Terraform, PowerShell, where obviously the code analysis is important. Mapping it with some features in Azure DevOps, you have security code scanning tools. You got a whole bunch of them. I don't remember the exact number. You got like 100 and I don't know, 42 or something. Where do I know that number from? We promised you some demos, so I'm going to continue talking about this slide, but then sharing my screen and then talking through some of the security capabilities. So imagine that you have your existing code, whatever that means, and you want to make it more secure. Because now you're like day 2, you could say. Day 1 is, woohoo, we're going to do Azure DevOps. It's already there. It's cloud service. Takes you half a day to set it up, maybe not even, but assuming you've never done it before, right? So day 2 is like, okay, we have source control. We have a project. We maybe have some sample pipelines that we find in the Microsoft Learn documentation, right? Where now we want to add that extra level of detail and adding security. So where do you get started? The easiest one is go to marketplace.visual Studio, and then for every cycle, Visual Studio Code, like that's where you're going to write your coding. And again, for apps or infrastructure as code. But then you also have Azure DevOps. So the mindset here is that a developer, even without using Azure DevOps, could already integrate code scanning. You go to Visual Studio, you search for security, and it's going to give you, ooh, I said 142. It's more in the meantime, 158. I have no idea which of these tools is better than the other, but that's not the message, because some of these extensions for Visual Studio are specifically for building containers, or better, to do code scanning on a container platform than traditional code. Some of these might be probably better for specific language. I know there's a few, like obviously this one here is what you would use for, guess what, .NET language. But if you have Java code, if you have Python code, the .NET secure code scanning will not really help you. So that's where you need to find out which of those might be relevant to what I'm using. But this is running on the developer local machine. But now if you switch to Azure DevOps and you do the same for security again, it's going to give you, 143 results. So there's one more compared to about 3 weeks ago. So that's where my 142 came from. But the logic is the same. We're now even better. You could have multiple tools depending where the code is running. So if you think about traditional antivirus, anti-malware security, you're going to run vendor 1 on your local device. You're going to run vendor 2 on the file server, or maybe on SharePoint, right? You're going to run vendor 3 in your email. We're now doing the exact same logic in a DevOps mindset. On the local developer machine, we install tool 1, it's going to run scanning. In a way that, for example, you could block like a source code updates with like pull requests and stuff, where now before accepting the pull request, you're going to run a code scanning. In short, how it works, I can show you a bit of that in a pipeline example.
For example, say I've just chucked an API key into the code, right? I don't want that ending up in plain text. Someone else can read, someone else can export. So validating and doing a decline, forcing me to not only remove the key, but also change it before I commit again.
Yep. And even better, but I'll talk about that a little bit later on. But imagine, so we're in step 1 or step 2, you could say, in our DevOps cycle. So we're writing code, we're moving it into source control, which I think is step 1 that you always have to do. Whenever you have your code in your repo, you go into a pipeline, and the only thing you need to do is adding one of those extensions. This is an example from Sonar Cloud, one of those 142 engines, right? Where you have your, I'll make it a little bit bigger. You have your traditional pipeline, which means in this case, we're scanning some .NET language, which means we have a task installing the .NET NuGet package manager. We're going to run NuGet install, restoring all those packages. And then later on, we have the build process. The only thing we're doing now is just injecting vendor XYZ. It is just called Sonar Cloud because that's my environment I have. And during the build process, we download NuGet, we download the packages, and then we're going to perform an integration with Sonar Cloud. Once we have Sonar Cloud connected, like, do you have the license to use the tool? That's mainly what's happening here. What kind of framework are you using? So it's going to download the correct bits. And then in the end, it's going to run the actual analysis, which means I'm going to look through all your code and I'm going to identify where are the potential security risks from outdated packages, from an outdated framework, all the way up to recognizing like secrets. Imagine you have an ARM template with, I don't know, an Azure storage account key. It's going to recognize it like, oh, Peter, watch out, because you're not supposed to have that key in your, I don't know, app settings JSON file, something like that. So those are some of the easy things. We're now going back to the multi-layered approach. Nothing would block you from looping through vendor 1 in the example I share here. And why not looping through another vendor, which could, for example, be GitHub? Because not too long ago, a few months ago, actually, we released GitHub security for Azure DevOps. So the idea behind it is Dependabot and CodeQL coming from GitHub, and they literally build and maintain it, but now bringing that security detection engine into your Azure DevOps pipelines. And let's see if I actually have an example of that. Maybe not, but
While you do that, are you happy if I share my screen? I've got something to share.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. So while Peter finds that, I will share my screen. So an example of one of the things you could do is something very similar to this. So sorry, Teams pop-ups in the way of my cursor as it is. So there's a product that a couple of Microsoft engineers are working on. It's an open source project, but it's essentially a really good pipeline template repository workflow to get you going in these type of examples called Symphony. So Symphony is really a continuous integration to continuous deployment framework that they put together that can get you going with infrastructure as code, whether it's using Azure Bicep or using Terraform as well. And it's free. It's a set of frameworks, set of patterns and best practices for deploying, testing infrastructure as code. It also includes modern DevOps, like it's got pull request pipelines as well, and IIC code validation and it's actually linting, not linting. Automated testing, security scanning, and using open source tools. So I'll put it in the chat, but one of the things I wanted to show you really was the workflow. And this is very similar to what Peter's talking about, where you have a couple of pipelines. So in this example, you've got a pipeline that's called the validate pipeline. And this pipeline will help prepare your environment. So it'll download the tools necessary on the Azure DevOps agents or the GitHub runners that you're running it on. It'll run the custom scanners. So these are the tools that Peter was talking about, right? The security tools that you need to do before anything else to validate. It will run an IIC linting command. So is the formatting of those IIC code according to your standards? Does it look okay? It'll then run some extra validation, run some unit testing, and then publish reports. So this is what you'd want to do. You'd want to validate the code before you actually do the deployment. And then the second step is preview and deploy. So in this example, you validated it, it's all correct, it's all secure. It'll then go to the preview where it will run the IIC commands to preview the changes. So in Azure DevOps, it's a Terraform plan as an example. What are we going to do? What changes are going to be made? Then it will double check and confirm what kind of resources are going to get destroyed. It will run the deploy commands if everything's okay, and then it'll publish some reports on how it went. Then at the end, and this is something I haven't been using, but you can also do end-to-end tests as a final step as well of going, okay, we've just deployed application A. It's secure because we know we've already linted, validated it previously, but we want to make sure, is it running? Is this port responding? Does this web page exist? This is where you can do the final reports. But using a framework like this really helps. So here's an example of the pull request workflow that they've got currently on GitHub only, but you could do something very similar with Azure DevOps, right? So you could do the validate stage, which runs the Git leaks and the security scanners on the pull requests, like Peter was just talking about, running the linters, the validations, running your tests, then deploy once it reaches the main branch, and then you can run your test and your validate. And in this example, the code that the security scanners, this framework is using is Git leaks, which is used to scan and prevent secrets. So it's using a bunch of regex to go, is this a subscription key? Is this an API key, a Cloudflare-based key, open source tool, running it, and then it will cancel out the deploy. And then there's some alternatives here. So I'll put this in the chat, but hopefully that's a good starting point to get you going.
That's quite nice.
Sorry, Peter. I thought
No, totally
I'll
fine.
share that because
So while you were doing that, I actually prepped a little new project. I'll just share my screen again. Well, maybe I was a bit too fast, but that's fine. So I created a new little project. I'll share my GitHub repo in a minute, where I got a few like hands-on labs that I use in different workshops, where one of them is integrating security. So while you were doing your thing, I was trying to like quickly build something on the fly, but maybe I need to look into it a little bit more, but that's fine. So I got a new project, new repo, imported some sample source code. And then my idea would be to show you how you can integrate that GitHub security into your pipeline. But for some reason, it's not doing what it needs to do. Just trying to figure out what is missing. But that's not going to block me from probably scanning.
the demo gods might need more coffee or more sacrifices today.
Well, I mean, I would say that's the fun of doing, like, ask me anything, and I'm not going to do it like it's prepped 15 times and it's like easy. And then you try to do the same in your environment and you go like, wait a minute. In Peter's session, that demo was amazing, but I tried to do this on my end and it's not working at all. So that's what I like about it, like debugging live and just showing you how stuff is working.
Yeah.
Let's see.
And don't worry, like red and errors is all just part of the fun, right? Yeah. You should see when I'm deploying something for a customer, usually there is quite a lot of reds before I get to the green. And then I'll sneakily go in and delete all the reds. So it makes me look really good, but yeah, I've just spent hours and hours dealing with every issue. It's just normal, and it's part of the fun of this deployment.
So what I'll do is I'll pick another sample project that I have. That's fine. So first is you go into project settings, repos, and then under settings over here, you're gonna enable advanced security, which means I'm gonna bring in the GitHub security for Azure DevOps. So we're trying to not focus too much on Azure DevOps, GitHub. It's just you want additional source code security, just enable it. You can do this for all repos. If you got like a multi-repo scenario, you might not enable it for all at once. So that's a little bit of flexibility you have. And then you go into your pipelines. So this is another example. And again, it's just doing a build stage. I'm not publishing anything yet. So it's .NET Core, CLI, restore, build, publish, creating my web deploy package mainly. That's what we're doing. Well, now if we want to integrate our security scanning, the one coming in from GitHub, I'm going to try and do this on the fly.
This is an example of using the best of both worlds, right? So GitHub Advanced Security was built into GitHub first, and then Microsoft was able to integrate a lot of the capabilities into Azure DevOps as well. So
we're just going to add a new task and then fighting with some YAML indentation. Task. Oh, look at that. Advanced Security Code QL. That's what I need. So we got 3 different stages. We got init, build, and analyze. So what's the difference? Init means initialize it, like communicate with the GitHub backend, download all the bits and bytes that you need, and you're telling the pipeline, I want you to run this code QL. Where then second, you're going to run scanning, and that's the actual, what I call the pattern detection mechanism. And then eventually you're going to run the analyze it. And then the auto build is doing some additional automation, but you don't really need all that in a build pipeline. So we could do task help me a bit here, advanced security code QL init. And then we also need to define, I shouldn't do this in the DevOps interface. I should do this from my VS Code and then pull requesting it, right? But I'm going to try and do it just like this. Where input, I remember I need to specify the language inputs, and hopefully I'm in the right spot. Inputs, tab, languages, C#. So I'm telling, hey, I want to use that advanced security code QL, bring in the GitHub default by design code QL. And then from there, telling like, I don't need everything because this is a C#.NET language. So forget about all the other detection frameworks you have. I just need the C# components. And then the other piece is probably somewhere here. We're going to do the same thing. We're going to run a task where now this time it's the dependency scanning. That's the actual scanning mechanism. And we're going to run another task, and that's the analyze. Activity. And then the IntelliSense is not doing what it needs to do. Oh, there we go. Code QL analyze. And that's pretty much it. Let's see what it does. And run. By the way, I'll share that GitHub repo with some of the hands-on labs. There you go, it's in chat window. Now, while this is running, since we're mainly talking about security, right? You mentioned, Luke, like, oh, we're going to do this linting stuff for Power, for PowerShell or anything else in the meantime. And it's going to recognize secrets, like Azure storage accounts, AWS keys, or anything else that you have. Where now, I would recommend you to maybe try and avoid even having secrets in your source code. Where the question is like, okay, but where do we store them? Now, out of, I would say, Azure, obviously the answer would be Azure Key Vault. If you go like, well, but we're not using Azure Key Vault because we got, I don't know, Terraform scripts, then yes, you can do about the same with Terraform Vault. And if you use AWS, I'm pretty sure they got some AWS Vault-alike scenario. Now, within Azure DevOps, one of the nice things is that you can go into library, and that's where you're going to store your keys. So there's two different ways to do this. So this example here, it's a SQL password, like my connection string, or just a SQL admin account, username, password, why not? And you're going to encrypt it in DevOps. So the way it works is I'm going to do the, I don't know, the Luke password. And this is going to be add Luke with some super fancy way to describe this, right? There we go. That's your password. Okay, cool. Now I'm going to encrypt it. As long as you don't save it.
I have to change my password now.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, this. Oh, I'm sharing my screen and it's getting recorded. My apologies. I forgot about this, but that's fine. We're going to save this. And it's now stored secretly in DevOps. The pipeline can read it out because you point to like, hey, pick up this variable in the exact same way as you would do for any other variable. But it's still linked to DevOps. We're now, again, thinking a bit about using the best of both worlds or multiple worlds, right? It means that now the only way to pick up this secret is connecting to DevOps. But what if you have DevOps and you want to move into GitHub? What if you have part of your DevOps team that's now using Terraform to deploy some stuff? That's where you could now go to, oh, let's store this in a central repo. Yes, that's now storing or actually pulling up my variables from Key Vault. So you need an Azure subscription, which means you need an Azure DevOps service connection. And we might talk about that a bit more later on if anyone has questions. And you're going to point to your Key Vault name. So I have my Key Vault in my Azure. Do I have my Azure portal open? Yes. So I'll go into Key Vault. And this is where you're now going to tell your team, whatever that means, right? If you have any secrets, store them in Key Vault. Well, now we can see even in my own environment, I'm logged on as PE Tender, my admin, global Azure admin account, and I do not have permissions. Why not? Because I locked down following the Microsoft guidelines on how to manage your Key Vault, where you have the Azure resource admin, the person who's managing the Key Vault service, and you're going to have the permissions or access control RBAC to actually manage the content. For now, if I go to secrets, you can see that I do have the permissions to manage my secrets, but not keys. And that's just RBAC, right? So nothing too fancy. Now, going back to this little piece here. So this is your Azure subscription pointer. So what we call the service connection, which means that before you can run this, you need to create an Azure DevOps service connection. You need to create a service principal typically, and you need to define the correct RBAC permissions to do that. Sharing a bit on that, your service connection is linked to a project, which is already DevOps security, I would say level 1 or maybe level 2 or 3, depending what you're doing within Azure DevOps. But the idea is that you're going to create an integration from Azure DevOps to your Azure backend, where the pipeline, or in this example, the Key Vault pulling up information task, is not running in your admin credential mode. Because it's a pipeline, it's automation, which means there is no interactive logon. So what you need to do here is create new service connection, and it's going to ask you a few options. So we're going to target Azure, and then it's going to show me like a whole set of things to choose from. If you follow some Microsoft guidelines, it's typically the recommended is the way forward. I don't always agree because it might not always be recommended in your specific scenario. Why not? Because in this case, you have no idea what workload identity is. So why would you go for that option if you don't know what it means, right? The other thing is automatic. So there are a few dependencies, and I'll spend a minute on this. So I'm not going to talk about workload identity because I first want to position the other ones, where you have service principal. The service principal is like a Entra ID service account object that we used to call a service account in the past, where now the automatic means that, oh, Peter, as the Azure DevOps admin, the assumption, and that's important, the assumption is that you do have the correct permissions to create a service principal. Now, that might work fine in a small environment, maybe medium environment. If you are the global Azure admin, you're the security admin, you got all the permissions that you need, yes, automatic is going to work. But in most organizations, we don't trust our Azure DevOps team. And it's not about not trusting people, it's just following what we call zero trust within Microsoft, like verify explicitly, least amount of privileges. Why would we give you permission to create a service principal if you're typically not doing that as your day-to-day job? So that's where automatic, I would say, forget about it. Again, it's not wrong if you use it, if you do have the permissions, and on top, you know what it actually means. So now you would go for manual, where once you go for manual, it's going to ask you like, okay, can you provide me the service principal details? Which now means you have to go back to Entra. You need to have the correct permissions. You need to create a service principal. And the downside of a service principal is that it's going to give you the credentials, which means it's going to show you the subscription ID, the subscription name, that's fine. It's going to give you the service principal ID and the key. So how do you share those with your DevOps team? In an email? Probably not, because you're sharing credentials, right? So that's where, and again, it's not wrong if you're using it, that's totally fine. But that's where you might go for one of the other options. So we go back. So you know that preferably you're not going to use service principal, and definitely not automatic because you don't have the permissions to create it. Manual, it's fine, but we don't like it that much anymore because we're sharing credentials. You might look into managed identity because that's our recommended option. If you have one Azure resource communicating with another Azure resource, like a web app connecting to SQL Azure, a virtual machine connecting to Cosmos DB, connecting to storage accounts, where the guidelines in meantime for about, I don't know, 3 years now, is if you can use managed identities, use managed identities. Because the big benefit is that there are no credentials that will be shared. The downside is that managed identity here only works with the self-hosted agents. So the virtual machines running Azure pipelines that you manage, you control, you own, you could say. So if you're using the Microsoft hosted ones, you cannot use managed identity. And that's where finally we can talk about workload identity federation. Because you know in meantime that the identity piece is based on Entra ID, which means it's following all OpenID OAuth security protocols. So in short, what workload identity is doing is instead of you handing out credentials to Azure DevOps pipelines, like if you run this pipeline, I want you to use this set of credentials, you're now actually giving the bare minimum of permissions to the pipeline to reach out to Entra and asking, like, can I please get a one-time token that just allows me to run this pipeline? So instead of storing credentials in Azure DevOps, you're now just allowing it to ask for a credential. But it's all running behind the scenes. It's not stored in memory. It's nowhere available, which means it cannot be cracked. It cannot be hacked. It cannot be pulled up. You just need to create a little trust, like that's where the federation comes from, to tell your Entra, like, well, I got this Azure DevOps environment that I manage. It's part of my Azure tenant subscriptions and everything. And it's a trusted application. And then once you have that trust established, if my Azure DevOps environment reaches out to you, my dear Azure, to provide a pipeline run, can you please hand out a token that allows the pipeline to run? That's like, I would say, the simplification of the process. And we might share a link, some of the Learn articles that actually detail on that. I don't have it running in this project, and it's not really something you can do like quickly on the fly because there's some pre-requirement steps that you need to enable in your Entra to create that trusted app registration and establishing that relationship between the two platforms. But if you go like, oh my God, this is amazing. Yes, it is amazing. It's for now the highest level of security you can establish. And again, it's not storing credentials. You don't need to share them. You don't need to store them in source code whatsoever. And everything else is still working. So even in an existing project, like in my case, this project got created probably 5 years ago when I joined the Microsoft role and creating my demo environment. For now, it's going to tell me here, like, well, preferably, we're going to offer you to convert your existing service principal scenario from before into the workload identity. And you just need to go through some of those prerequisite steps, and that's pretty much it. Nothing's changing. Your pipelines are not impacted. You don't need to rewrite your service connection scoping whatsoever. So that would be my recommendation. Let's see. Let's go back to that one slide. I'm going to show it super ugly from here. Let's zoom in on this screen. So we had threat modeling everything before integrating security. Then we talked a lot about the code scanning, integrating any of those, I don't know, third-party vendor flavors where I showed you Sonar Cloud or using the GitHub for Azure DevOps security. And then the next part, if we move it a little bit, is once we have it up and running. So the scenario now is we have the code, we have the pipelines, we're going to publish it, and now it's running in Azure. How do we protect our environment? That's knowing more about the cloud target backend. So again, we briefly talked about RBAC, which means your DevOps team might be responsible, or the developers might be responsible for developing it, but not managing it. Or they don't need to be global admins in Azure because they're typically not really managing Azure resources, right? And again, it might be different in your environment because you might have a team that has a lot of permissions. But again, I would say try to work with the least amount of privileges. Or if you want to pay for it, and it's not negative, but we have privileged identity management. It's a Entra ID license option. So you got Premium P1 and Premium P2. So privileged identity management is a P2 license, but you don't need to license all the users. I would say mainly the key users within the company needing admin permissions, where instead of having the permissions all the time, like we used to do for the last, 25 years, right? Oh, you're part of IT, you get all the permissions. We're now moving to a scenario where if you need that specific permission, you're going to ask for it. So it's just flipping over the mindset into a different approach, but actually elevating the security quite a lot. And then obviously the security monitoring. So in short, that would be Defender for cloud, the Azure Security Center, old name, where it's going to give you a view on your security Azure state. If you want, you can bring in Google Cloud and AWS, but then also having a pointer to your DevOps environment. And
we did have a question around
cool.
Azure DevOps and Defender for Cloud. I'm not sure if you've got that configured already in your environment. If not, I can demo mine, but
let's quickly check. I think I have it. There you go. Yep. So in short, what it does, the starting point is add an environment. So where do you have your DevOps backend, source code pipelines, pretty much everything? It's GitHub. It's going to ask you for your GitHub credentials, Azure DevOps, obviously, and then GitLab, something new, but I'm not running that. And then from there, it's going to analyze. So the cool thing is, think back about Defender for Cloud being a monitoring tool. So it's not changing anything. It's not modifying anything in your pipelines, but it's going to look into the pipelines, and it's going to tell you which of your repos might have security issues. Like all those recommendations in GitHub or Azure DevOps, I enabled this one for GitHub, where I could go into my project. This is the sample one that I shared a little bit earlier, and it's going to list up within this GitHub repo. There are a few security risks, and it's low for now. That's fine. It's a pretty recent project, so framework-wise, everything is quite okay. But the lowest level of recommendation is like, well, maybe, Peter, you should have code scanning enabled. So what we can do is go into GitHub. I don't have it anymore. I'm going to remove this little annoying Teams pop-up for sharing screen. So you would go into your GitHub repo, and then here you would enable security. I'm not signed in, so you might fix that. No, not good. It's the downside of passwords.
We'll look away while you type it in.
Why? No, you don't have to look away. I hope it's not going to show whatever I'm typing. It just
no, it's that old saying, right? People are looking at me, so yeah, everything I type is wrong.
It's what you do when you use Key Vault as your password manager now. And then MFA, obviously. Come on, phone, wake up. Good. So I'm in my GitHub repository, go into settings, go into security, code security, and you're just going to enable it. I'm not going to do it for now because I need this for some other scenarios, but that's really how easy it is. From here, it's going to run the CodeQL and Dependabot. Those are the two engines from GitHub. And every day, at least, it's going to send you some updates. And that's what the Defender for Cloud is picking up as well. So it's mainly the monitoring piece. It's not adding, I would say, security as such. So you still need to enable it on your GitHub backend. But at least the reporting is centralized. And that's just following the whole logic and mindset about you got different cloud teams doing different things in Azure. And in Defender for Cloud, we're just going to bring all that stuff together. And if you want to see an example of what it looks like, I have one actually not too long ago. Got way too many repos. It's something Node related. I guess it's this one. So this was a React app. Well, not that long ago. Okay, Peter, it's 2 years old now. But what I did at that time was just creating a new React app in Visual Studio, whatever version at that time, going into my settings, reading out security. And within, I don't know, 30 minutes, it would tell me like, well, this is just wrong. And I was like, I use this as the next finish sample project. And it's literally reading out like all the potential security issues. So over here, it now lists up 26, where it's going to tell me like, well, these are all the security flaws in this next finish sample project. I didn't build it on purpose. It's just the default templates coming from the Node React at that time. And I know it's 2 years old, but I mean, that's what we call legacy code, right? I wouldn't even say that 2 years is legacy. But going back to the start, this is the challenge we have in our DevOps environments, where it's not only about bringing your automation into existence, it's about bringing your code, scanning it, making sure that you cannot just deploy it without knowing that it's all safe and secure. Because if you run this code, you're going to publish this, just a basic web app. I mean, in an hour, maybe a day from now, it's not going to be your application anymore. And that's what we need to protect our organization for. Cool. Was a good question. Easy question. What about security in Azure DevOps? Oh, let's talk for an hour about that one question.
It's worth knowing that while you were talking and demoing, I've been able to connect my own Defender for Cloud to GitHub. So I had my Defender for DevOps in Azure configured to my Azure DevOps, but I hadn't configured it to GitHub. So already I've gone through the onboarding because I already have the rights to do it. And the time that you took to demo that within the 5 minutes was enough time that it took me to start the onboarding experience as well. So now I have to wait for Defender for Cloud to bring in my GitHub repos, but very easy. Click, 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 select, done.
And I would say the detection and not breaking down any of the third-party security tools, but I think it's one of the better ones in meantime because it supports like almost all development languages out of the GitHub security. So it's no longer what I mentioned before, like, oh, I'm going to run vendor 1 because it's .NET and then vendor 2 because it's, I don't know, a Java app or something. But now it's just one backend. It's one engine and it recognizes everything. And I'll share the link. I talked about the security patterns, like what is getting detected. A little bit updated article, but somewhere.
Yeah, but as you talked about, it's all about shifting less left as possible, and then Defender for Cloud, at the end can help you with the run as well. It's a constant feedback loop. I'm just wary of time.
Oh, yeah.
Is there
Good point.
is there yeah, this is great. It's gone quite quickly, which is really good. Like you said, we could probably talk about this for hours. If there's any last questions in the chat, um, just let us know.
Yeah, I was looking for, there's a listing in the docs, what secret patterns it recognizes, like AWS keys, Azure Storage Account keys, Azure SQL, DevOps Personal Access Token, if you have those ones in your source code, and a lot of other vendor platform keys as well. Oh, this one. And it just happens, right? Like, although I shouldn't, but it just happens. When I built like demo apps, it's so easy to just add some keys in app settings JSON, and then you think, oh, at some point I'm going to remove these. And half of the time you just forget about it because it happens. It's so easy to do. And then you upload it, because in some of our workshops, they go like, oh, Peter, that's a cool demo app. Are you able to share it? And then I'm like, oh, yeah, well, quickly let me upload it into GitHub. And before you know it, you're like, oh, shoot, I created that app a year ago, and now it has some connection string in there. And that's what this is all getting blocked off. Like Azure, a whole bunch of stuff. AWS is in there. So yeah, pretty cool. And I love the fact that, again, they bring this GitHub technology into an existing Azure DevOps environment now. So pretty cool stuff.
Are there any resources? I mean, you've shared a fair amount of links with us already throughout this presentation, which is great. Is there any resources maybe related to AZ400 that like for people wanting to learn this stuff who may have beginner or intermediate knowledge of Azure DevOps that we could end with, or?
Yes. Well, obviously you got like the whole learn section. Now, if you're a little bit more in, I would say the learn by doing, the one that I always recommend is just go through our official DevOps class hands-on labs. So any Microsoft official courseware is typically having a bunch of labs where out of the Azure 400, so it's like a 4-day class, so it's about 32 hours, you could say, where we actually have more than 20 hours of lab time, which means in real life workshop deliveries, we cannot even complete all the labs during the 4-day classes. So we need to cherry pick, using a DevOps term there, some labs where we would go to, well, if you have no DevOps background whatsoever, go through like lab 1, go all the way to the end. If you have DevOps experience, but you want to learn more about GitHub, skip a DevOps pipeline lab to do a GitHub Actions lab. So that's what I could recommend. Like if you learn by doing, then I think this is a great resource because it's always getting updated. Like the content team is watching over all the issues, the fixes, and typically within, I would say, a week, it's already from, oh, this is not working anymore because whatever. Like the biggest updates actually happened after the build conference, because that's where Microsoft typically publishes a whole bunch of changes. And some of the labs did not work anymore, or the instructions were not always clear because naming is typically getting updated as well. So I would say this is, at least to me, one of the greatest resources we have, apart from everything that you have on Learn. And then since they're back, why not talking for one more minute, if you allow me to, talking about the applied skills. So for the ones who don't know, applied skills is something Microsoft published last year as not a replacement for the official certification, but it actually helps validating your skills. Imagine you're like a DevOps engineer and you want to become a DevOps engineer, and you're mainly focusing on on-prem environment management. Why would you need to go through a 4-day class learning about Azure if that's not your target environment? Or you want to use Azure DevOps to publish, I don't know, something against like AWS or any other, just an example. So what we're doing now is moving to what we call applied skills. And it's a 2-hour lab environment. You're going to dive in. So you don't need an Azure subscription. You just get access to a hosted lab environment, and you're going to perform certain tasks. So for now, there's 26, and they were gone for a few weeks because we actually tried to keep these updated as close as possible. And there are a few linked to DevOps. Like over here, whoops.
Yeah, there's a lot more applied skills than since I last looked at it. So semantic kernel, I saw an Active Directory one as well. So yeah, definitely getting updated all the time.
Like, yeah, just here I'm like highlighting 4 of them where I think they relate somewhat to DevOps, right? So you got deploying Kubernetes. You got the cloud native apps with container apps. You got Azure Monitor. It's not really pipelines, but it's still the ops piece of DevOps, right? So, and that's where you can now focus a lot more and validating again your skill. So you don't have to pay for it. If you go through and you fail, you need to wait, I think, 2 or 3 days, and then you just start it up again and you go through it again. I love these because I like, well, not only demoing stuff, but I learn by doing. And this is literally doing and learning. So, and it also comes with a link to the Learn catalog. So let's say Kubernetes. You could go like, well, I think I know enough about Kubernetes, so I'm just going to jump in and hopefully succeeding in getting through it. But if you go like, well, this is really something that I need to like learn for my job in the next coming weeks or months, it already has like all the learn material. So you would first go through the learning path. And then once you go like, well, I start understanding it, I know how it goes, I think I'm ready. You just jump in. If you're ready, cool, you pass. If not, 3 days later, you pick up the learn path that you missed, and then you just continue. So pretty cool stuff. Cool.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you for sharing that with us, Peter.
Sure.
And yeah, thank you for presenting and sharing your knowledge with us today. I know we had a couple of reschedules there, but yeah, it's good to
busy schedule every now and then.
Stuff happens, and for the audience, like Peter's sharing, he's free time to deliver this to us. So thank you very much for doing that. If there's no other questions,
I shared one placeholder slide with my contact details, so feel free to reach out if anyone has additional questions or just want to stay in touch. More than happy to do that.
Thank you. I'll just want to finish it off by sharing my thank you, which I actually borrowed from a previous presentation that you've done. So thank you very much for coming and presenting to us today. Thank you everyone for your questions and making this very interactive. Yeah, I'll finish recording, but yeah, thank you. And yeah, hopefully you've learned something, and feel free to reach out. Thank you, Peter.
So my pleasure. Enjoy the rest of your days, evenings, mornings, whatever time zone you're in, and I hope to see you next time. Thank you, Luke, for having me.